Hello, welcome to today's session. I want to thank again Dr. Andrekos Varnava for being with us today, talking about, I don't know if it's his latest book, but one of his most recent books, Assassination in Colonial Cyprus in 1934 and the Origins of Eroka. Outstanding book. I'm going to say Poirot, move over, because, being a political scientist, this had everything that I liked. And sometimes I'm surprised at how real life is so much more interesting than fiction. It has, obviously, politics. It has struggles for power. It has political machinations, political struggles, and major, I think, political implications. I've mentioned it to you. When I started reading the book, right in the very beginning, in the acknowledgments, where we sort of, put our souls out there and a little bit more open, you say, this is my shortest book. And even though it's short, it's just so much information, really easy to read. But you say, it's my shortest book, but it's the most difficult I've written. And, I thought, wow, that's interesting that he says that. But as you read along and you really come to the conclusion and think about some of the implications, major implications, because I'm sure you'll talk about this. What we're talking about is the assassination of Antonios and, forgive me, Triantafylides in 1934, and really how, in the long run, it's how about this changed the political future of Cyprus.
Yeah.
And it's really, I would say, historical forensic, political, institutional change, etc., etc. My first question is really, how does something like this come about?
Yeah. I mean, it was a long time working on this. About a decade ago, I think it's fair to say it started about a decade ago. It's a long time to work on a small book, but I was obviously working on other things as well. But about a decade ago, the National Archives of the UK announced that it had documents that it had, as they referred to it, retained after they had left various colonial possessions. So they issued or released a list of those files that they had retained, that they had removed when they had left. And it doesn't simply relate to Cyprus, it relates to all of the colonial possessions. And I received the list on Cyprus and I studied the list. And the list of files doesn't simply relate to, whatever the last years of colonial rule, when in many instances it became a little messy. It goes way back to World War I. And on that list, there was a file on this case, titled something like Assassination of Antonios Triantafylides, and well, who wouldn't be intrigued by a file with that title? And I immediately wondered about two things. The first thing to say is that having been to the archives in Cyprus, which are the archives of the Colonial Secretary or Chief Secretary, and I knew that there were files there that I had in many instances requested, and they come back and say this file is not here. And I had worked out that in the original list created by the chief secretaries or the colonial secretaries, there was a dot next to many of the entries. And I worked out that whenever there was a dot, that was a file that was supposedly missing. And there is a file in that list with this title. So I realized that these files that had been removed were those files. They're not all of them though. There are files on the original sort of register that have not been, they're not on the list released by the National Archives. And the other thing that was interesting about the list was that this file was closed for 100 years. So it wouldn't have been opened until 2034, as he was assassinated in 2034, and the file was opened then in 1934. He was assassinated, and the file was opened in 1934. So I immediately had to put in a Freedom of Information request. It was rejected, and I had a certain time to appeal that. I feel that many times that rejections sort of just happen
Automatically.
Yeah. Anyway, so on the last day that I could appeal, I remember where I was in Cyprus, and I thought, there's no reason why I shouldn't appeal. So I appealed, and it was granted to open the file. However, 6 pages were retained, and passages were redacted. I felt at the time, however, that I had enough to go ahead with my plan to write an article. That was my original intention. It was at this point, I had also discovered a second file in the Colonial Office records, which was opened, and the reason why I had originally missed it was the spelling of his name. Can't remember if I say this story in here.
I don't believe so.
Yeah, the spelling of his name in one file was PH, the trianda fi, lidis part, and in the other file it was spelt with an F. So I missed that file. And what's intriguing and really interesting is that both files contain in some instances the same documents. And obviously the Colonial Office file was not redacted in any way. So I therefore knew what they had redacted in another file. In the other file, the FCO one, I should have been clear. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office files are the so-called retained files. So both files had the same document. In one of them it was redacted, and in the other one it was not redacted. So I knew what they had redacted, which is, I'm not sure if this has happened in other instances. And what they had redacted was totally innocuous and really unconnected to the substance of the file or the case. And what's interesting is that they didn't redact certain things that you might have thought they would, and that was the evidence against a certain group, which I discuss in the book. They didn't redact that, but they redacted this very innocuous thing. So as I said, I moved forward and prepared an article. Obviously, I went a lot further than just these files. I started looking at basically everything that I thought might be connected to it, everything before, things after, in the archives, in the National Archives in the UK, in the Cypriot State Archives, which, as I've said, is the Chief Secretary's or the Colonial Secretary's records. And then I began to grapple with this idea of the community of records, or colonial records. And I began, this is the first anything really that I've produced where I went this far with my multilingual skills, and read a lot of material from the Cypriot newspapers and indeed the Greek ones, which is not easy because it's not modern. It's not Demotic Greek. It's written in an archaic form of Greek in those days, but that was a necessity because the court records, because eventually someone was charged, they went on trial and they were acquitted. The court records were missing for this case. So I had to read the newspapers and to get the full, and because they went in a lot of detail into the court case. It was the talk of the town, obviously, right, so to speak, talk of the island.
Yeah. Yeah, I do notice that. I think it's chapter 3. There's a description. Really, the sources are those newspapers. If just moving forward, because you were saying you wanted to do this as an article, and I don't know if it was once or twice you were rejected, and I'm thinking this is. So I'm wondering, going back to my original, note was why was this so hard? And you really highlight this, I think, in maybe the first chapter, the second chapter, how this is a major political figure of his time. but it's something that's been absent from mainstream, I think, history of colonial Cyprus and even modern Cyprus. The paper is rejected. You would think this is really, it's a murder story of massive implications even today. We'll talk maybe a little bit later about that. Why was this so hard? Why do you think this was a story that had not been told? Obviously, there's issues with access to information, but there seems to have been a deliberate attempt to sort of not address this issue.
Absolutely. There's very little in the written record about the case, and it's been suppressed from Cypriot national consciousness. This is something that, talking with other people about when I was in Cyprus, and also Cypriots here, but mainly from when I'm in Cyprus, most people didn't have an understanding of it. They didn't know that it had happened. Those that did had a sort of, oh yeah, I have an opinion on this, and would go on to discuss the personal dimensions, I would refer to them as the unsavory personal dimensions that, as I establish in the book, really get created at the time, by those who potentially were behind it. But everybody had an opinion on it. One of the people who really encouraged me was Dr. Nicholas Carras, whose grandfather was the only other witness. So he had personal information from his grandfather, which essentially matched the record pretty closely. I'm not at all surprised by that. So it's been suppressed because of A, they wanted to hide what they had done, and B, because they wanted to put Triantafylidis into a box and close that box, and to, vilify him both politically and personally. They couldn't just do it politically, so they had to establish that the unsavory personal
the extramarital affairs and all those things.
And basically that's why it's been suppressed, and they didn't want it to come out.
If we can just, because I'm hoping, right, and I'm sure you're hoping as well, I'm thinking, we want, it is really worth, and I think one of the beautiful things, and I've said this probably to you before, the difference between historians is they write very, very clearly, contrary to political scientists tend to be much more filled with jargon in their writings. This is a really good read, but I'm wondering, obviously we want people to read it, but if you could just give us a very brief overview of what the story is here. What's involved here, and maybe the importance of this.
Sure. So Antonios Triantafylidis was a leading politician and lawyer, very successful lawyer in Cyprus, and he had begun to become political soon after returning to the island after completing his studies in Greece, and eventually became involved in politics in different times, part of deputations, for example, to London early on, and then later becoming, for a short period, member of the Legislative Council, and didn't quite work out. And then after the events of 1931, when there were demonstrations that eventually led to the burning of Government House, he really wasn't particularly involved in that. But it's very interesting that he sympathised with the British in some respects, and then in 1933, so after the events of October 1931, the British suspended the Constitution, and as a first step to restoring constitutionalism, they introduced an advisory council. And it's very telling that the governor wasn't sure who he was going to invite when he was communicating with the Secretary of State, except he had one person in mind, and that was Triantafylidis. And the story was that he attended one meeting and then was shot as he returned home with, as I said, with Nicholas Correas, who shares the name of his grandson. And they returning home, they happened to live next door to each other, and was assassinated. And that what is it, roughly less than 12 hours from his assassination to his death, it was very difficult to recreate. And there's a lot of unknowns about it. What's interesting is the figures who were there. He didn't die instantly, which is interesting. So I don't believe in conspiracy theories, but an assassination is generally a conspiracy, and assassinations happen. So, so the events are that he ended up dying, and then around 12 months later, someone's put on trial for the assassination, and he was accused of being part of a communist conspiracy simply because he had been a member of the Communist Party. However, at the trial, the witnesses for the prosecution, several witnesses, not just one, basically made it very clear whom they understood to have been behind it, and it wasn't the communists. And although they believed that the person accused was guilty because he confessed to them and threatened them, he had also told them who had paid him. And that person was a right-wing extremist, connected very well with persons who had been deported after the events of 1931, and he himself had been, it's very difficult to describe. Basically, several people were removed from their homes, the towns that they lived in, and taken to the countryside and put under sort of arrest, home arrest, sort of a house arrest. And he had been one of them. So, basically you have these witnesses who are not working for you because the prosecution has a sort of case, but your own witnesses are contradicting your case in a very serious way. So this became even more intriguing by virtue of what happened at the trial. And the evidence seemed to be very, or I won't say very clear, but pointing towards a conspiracy not from the communists but from right-wing extremists who were being controlled or directed by persons who were deported and living in Athens and being very active in their propaganda there. And you spoke about how this was difficult for me to do. I mean, it's difficult because of what happened, and trying to understand that this actually was a human being who lost their lives. But there's the additional aspect of how important this event really was to Cypriot history and colonial history more broadly. And it's a significant turning point because Triantafylidis was trying to rebuild relations with the British, and which had been significantly damaged by the events of 1931. And he wasn't the only one who agreed with this policy, but he was the one in the position to take it up, so to speak. And this could have led, and is likely to have led, to a constitutional path in the same way that it did, for example, in neighbouring Malta.
Yeah.
The British were inclined to, reintroduce or re-engage in a constitutional path. But this seemed to put a sort of end to that, at least until after the Second World War, when there was another attempt at the constitutional path. And that in itself is interesting, because it's discussed in the book as well, and maybe we'll come to it later. But it was emotional for me because I was, first of all, saying who I thought did it.
Yeah.
Or who I thought was behind it. Fairly certain that the guy who went on trial did it, but he's an instrument, of those who paid him. And that's why it was very emotional. Not because I have any emotional attachment to the people who did it, but because it's a very serious thing. And I had to have it all checked out by a lawyer and everything. And I made myself very clear that this is what I think is most likely to have happened, and that's all that historians do in any event is attempt to recreate the past based on the records.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think a lot of times I'm going to use the political example, the difference between political commentary and political analysis, right?
Yeah.
This is well substantiated. You're making a claim, but you're substantiating on some these records, and we could talk a little bit about the community of records.
Yes.
But before we go there, I just because I am a political scientist, not a historian. I think it's a really interesting story also about political development, political change. One individual who embraced this idea really of reform and cooperating, and you make that distinction, I think, between cooperation and collaboration
Yes.
with the British. And those individuals where it's not about reform, it's about no cooperation, no compromise
That's
whatsoever.
right. Yes.
And really how these used also this assassination as a way of showing and indicating and signaling to others that anyone who was willing to compromise was also in danger. And I think that's really interesting, because we see a lot of times avenues which we would think are rational and available to people sometimes are just not really a true option, because the reality on the ground and the politics is so much more complex than that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So if you would allow me just to come back then to this substantiating your claim, and you talk a lot about it, and the book is actually, the subtitle is Reading the Archives Against the Grain, and I think that's at the same place that you talk about the community of records. Can you tell us how, because you talk about the records, the British records, you talk a lot about how you had to use local media, you talk a lot also about rumors, and how you are able to triangulate and make sense of this complexity, and what you can claim as bona fide events and that you can prove, and other things that you really can't prove. How does this come about? How do you take all of these complex pieces to make sense of this puzzle?
Well, there's, I suppose, two things here. One is to acquire as many records as possible from different vantage points. That includes, of course, the National Archives and the Cypriot Archives, which, when I say Cypriot Archives, they're really British documents, British files, but they didn't make their way to the UK either at the time or later when they were removed, as we've established. But also there was also some private files, private archives that are in the public domain, such as the Stores papers. They were very interesting because it was very difficult to establish Triantafylidis's, not so much his career, but his views before his assassination, particularly before or at the time of the 1931 events, for example. So they were useful for that purpose. And also, not just the Stores papers, there are other papers in there as well. The Attorney General, for example, his papers were very influential and important. And I came across those at the very end almost. But it was going beyond those, and I've already talked about the Cypriot newspapers, but also I had to look at the newspapers in Greece in order to pursue this line that the those who had been deported in 31 were behind it. Because the British archives refer to this and have translations of some of these articles. So I wanted to not only check those out, and generally the translations that I've come across in my entire career in connection with my work on Cyprus have been good, and these were good, but I also wanted to go look at other articles that as well, that they may not have fallen on their table. So I expanded my community of records in that sense. And I always kept in mind the rumours, always kept them in mind, and it's difficult to not, but I also wanted to try to understand their origin as well and how they came about, and to come up with a sort of analysis in connection with that. And the other point, I'm just trying to remember your second part of your question now.
It was really about how do we disentangle what's false, and
that's right.
How do we come to a point where you're very specific here on who you think is responsible for this conspiracy, not only pulling the trigger, right? Because that one's much more straightforward. How can we get to a place? What do we need to do to have this certainty?
Well, I think it revolves around reading the archives, as I say at the beginning, both with and against the grain. So you need to read, when I say archives, I mean every single document, and to understand, well, who's written this document, who are they written it for, why have they written it, what have they said in it, what have they not said in it, and the other point also that may not be so clear is, how do they respond to the other information that they have? Do they respond or do they not respond? So, for example, you might remember where I talk about the evidence provided by two persons, and that is Triandafilidis' father-in-law, who happens to be Theophanis Theodotou, who was also deported after the events of 1931, but he remained in London, and he was, in his time, a very intransigent nationalist. But perhaps we could say not the same generation as those other ones who ended up going to Athens. He was older, or part of an older generation. And he was very clear on, not only was he very clear on what he believed, and that he believed that they were behind it, but he provided evidence that he was approached about creating a violent group, right, or a group, an organization that used violence to, including assassinate people who were working for the British.
To affect political events.
That's right. And so we don't really have much of a response from the British to that evidence. And the other one was from Surridge, who was a long-time officer in Cyprus, going back to World War I, certainly. And his evidence was that he was told by somebody in Cyprus, because he was in the UK at the time, that this group was behind it. And again, we don't have a British response to this. So it's important to keep in mind that what the British know, because we're looking at these files, and sometimes we don't stop and think that this is what they knew too. And what's important is to read the documents against
the grain. Yeah.
And the other big one is, so there's a lot of silences there. The switch to a communist conspiracy, because they did believe it was a right-wing conspiracy at the beginning. They did remove these individuals whom they thought were behind it, including the person who was named and accused by several witnesses in the court as having paid the guy on the guy charged. They had removed them and put them under house arrest in remote parts of the island. But then they switched to a communist conspiracy. And that switch is never really made clear in the archives, and is questioned. In fact, the archives, there's questioning of it. or there's questioning of the evidence at one point, particularly by the Attorney General, if I remember correctly. But they went through with it. And the other thing about reading the archives against the grain is reading some of the articles, particularly the differences between the articles in Cyprus, which were all about, talking about Triantafyllidis's life in positive way, by and large positive. Some hints at tension, but mainly positive. And the ones emanating from Athens, which were clearly written by Cypriots. In fact, one of them, from memory, signed a Cypriot. And we know about the activities of those who were deported around, the exiled or deported Bishop of Kyrenia and Savas Loizidis and others. And we know their views about Triantafyllidis from before, because they're all in the public domain. They're in the newspapers. And reading those against the grain and seeing that basically they're saying, look, this wasn't political, but it's good that he was killed. But he was killed for personal reasons. So they're trying very clearly to create this narrative that it wasn't them, is basically it. Yet all the evidence
points to a political motivation.
That's right.
For it. Yeah, well, picking up on that, because it is really about this struggle for and I'm going to go to this, the struggle for the definition of the narrative of liberation, right?
Yes.
And I'm thinking, this has got to have implications. I mean, we just talked before we came on camera, like we had a very similar situation in the country where I lived in Portugal, where for the first time the current Portuguese president assumed that the prime minister in 1980 was assassinated, and there's been a few committees, and I'm always surprised that there's very little action coming from there. But there's always movement every time there's a parliamentary commission. So I'm imagining, once you publish this, and now it's available to people, there are major implications. I think one for the British, and you just mentioned it. They might be complicit in a cover-up. Maybe
true.
that's an issue, but also for political life in Cyprus, because there is a clear connection between these events and the way that AOCA sort of creates this narrative of national liberation.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking, what is the wider contribution or impact of this? Maybe for these two dimensions.
Yes.
One, for the relationship with Britain, how Britain behaved, or British colonial history, and second, for political life in Cyprus.
Yeah. So, I mean, in the book I talk about the second part of that more than the first part, partly because the first part about a potential cover-up and conspiracy to hide it is a sort of, it's the weakest part, perhaps, of the evidence. However, there still is something there about it in connection with the communist conspiracy theory, the contradiction of the witnesses, and continuing to pursue it in light of the fact that this doesn't appear to be going anywhere and no judges are likely to convict on this, and other things around that. But that broader picture for British colonial history beyond just Cyprus needs to be taken up by other historians in order to understand this type of machinations and involvement in political development. And, potentially there could be something there for, around communism and around the suppression of communism and the pursuit of that through this, in this particular case, but also in many, many other cases. And many of those files remain either closed or redacted or whatever. But the second one, in connection with Cyprus, I mean, the implications are massive, and really this revolves around control of the the narrative around nationalism, the direction of a national liberation movement. And what's really interesting is that many years ago, do I need to work out when it was? It was well before I started this. In fact, I think it was back in 2009. And I'm going to refer to a historian here who has since passed away, and I've written about him, and that's Rolandos Katsaunis. And I remember being at a conference. He had this thing where he would not ask a question, but he'd give his own talk in response to somebody else's. I can't remember whose it was, but anyway, he got up and he gave this. He said basically that EOKA was more than just about uniting Cyprus to Greece. It was about control of the national liberation struggle, and it was about not including the communists and about taking it from them or excluding them. And, at the time, I thought this was very curious, but now I see that, and you can see from my book here, that there is a lot to be said for that. And really the implications for Cyprus and for Cypriot history and politics today is that this story is part of the EOKA story, hence the title. And it really goes back to 1929, not 1931, or 1951, or 1955. And people will know what I mean by those years. EOKA begins its activities in 55. There is a agreement to form what becomes EOKA in 1951. In 1931, there are the events which lead to the burning of Government House and the removal of the Constitution, and there are other restrictions. But in 1929 is when a group forms, a right-wing extremist group forms, which has in its sort of program the desire or in this program to use violence. And the same people who created that group in 1929, who were still alive in 1951, were behind the formation of EOKA.
And you do make that point sometimes, somewhere in the book, and I apologize, I'm sure I have it here highlighted. This idea was, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And this idea of how only their version is legitimized.
That's
and
right.
Even some of the means they were used, it seemed as a greater good within this struggle for national liberation.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's important to understand about this is that it was only about union with Greece, and that there was no interest in anything else, nothing interim, right? So the Constitution, when it was suspended in 31, they didn't really care that it was suspended in 31. They didn't care to go back to any type of constitution, nor did they care for an independent Cyprus. They wanted to go straight to union with Greece. They weren't interested in any stages or any steps or any phases. And in fact, they are on the record as having said, we would prefer what we have now, right, under the British, which was more or less nothing, this is after World War II, to having any constitution or even independence as an independent country before uniting with Greece. It was a very, very particular type of idea, policy, however you want to call it. And that needs to be understood, because even today people refer to what EOKA was as an independence movement. It was nothing of the sort. And they refer to it as having been, being popular. There's question marks, massive question marks about that. And this book goes a long way towards showing, not so much that, but showing the origins of that. Yeah. And even with what I say about 1946. Oh yes, and the very last part as well, where I give hypotheticals.
Yes, like a counterfactual, almost as what could have been if this gentleman had survived. Right? Here's a possible scenario that would mark a very different trajectory for Cyprus.
And that this was just one possibility. This wasn't the only possibility, of course. He could have died from natural causes,
Definitely.
but he might have tried to work with the British, and it may not have worked out, and he might have withdrawn or changed his position. However, based on my sort of years of understanding the history of Cyprus, but more than any other project that I've done, I delved deeper into these individuals around, not just around Triantafyllidis, but all different sides, so to speak. And people, these names keep popping up and up. And it appeared to me that there was a large amount of individuals, very intelligent individuals, whether they were lawyers or whatever they may have been, who were inclined to agree with Triantafyllidis. And this is why the scenario that I come up with, it would have just been a massive difference to the history of Cyprus, because Triantafyllidis seemed to me to be both practical and logical and practical, and many of the others around him seem to be the same. You will probably remember that I single out another person, particularly John Glididis. So John Glididis was a very important political figure on which very little has been written about him. He's the father of a subsequent president of Cyprus, Glafkos Glididis. John was a presidential candidate in the 1960 elections, and I think it's pretty extraordinary that he got the vote that he did, given the leadership that Makarios had in the 50s, and his role as ethnarch, on which I've also written about. But to get whatever it was, 30-something% is pretty substantial.
Impressive,
pretty impressive. And he is a constant figure in the 30s, 40s, and 50s even on the political scene. He didn't, have entirely the same views as Triantafyllidis, but he certainly was willing to cooperate with the British. So, based on my thinking, Glididis, who had worked with the left, he was the left-wing mayor in the 40s of Nicosia, and he was the only person who breaks up the mayorship of Dervis, Dr. Dervis, who is a fascinating figure. In this, he looms, doesn't he?
He does.
As a shadow. He's there for the assassination of Triantafyllidis in that part. He's there for let's call it the death of Archbishop Leontios under controversial, under very shady circumstances as well. And the connection with those former, in this case, exiles to that particular death is very interesting indeed. And Glididis just breaks up Dervis's mayorship there, whatever it is, 3 or 4 years when he's the mayor. He's a very interesting figure, and the scenario that I come up with, I don't think is entirely implausible as a counterfactual. Of course, it never happened, and we're not even close to having anything remotely like that. But I think it's important to understand how these events can change the course of history.
Yes, it for me makes, as someone who does a lot with presidential studies in the US, I'm really focused on individuals and the importance of individuals. It's not just about structure, and this really highlights the role that one individual or 2 or 3, could have been, is determinant for how a country progresses, right?
Yeah.
Let me ask you just a follow-on question, which is, what's been the feedback? What's been the reaction to this book? I can't imagine that you have not been contacted or, with people praising or maybe criticizing. What's been the impact on this book?
Well, the impact has been, there has been reaction, but there's also been a lot of silence as well. There's been reaction, as you can see, the academics who provided a comment, some of whom were also the reviewers, the peer reviewers, but there were many peer reviewers, incidentally. There were many rounds of peer review. There's been a review from the historian Jeremy Black, a short review, which is, very honoured that Jeremy Black, a very significant military historian, would take the time to even read this and provide positive feedback. I did receive. Before I mention that, I did send it to several newspapers in Cyprus, one of which promised to write a review. However, that review hasn't happened.
Pending.
I'm not surprised that if it doesn't happen, that Cypriots are, the broader Cypriot community who will want to engage with this will do so mostly in a private way.
Mm-hmm.
I don't expect to see this being discussed publicly on the news or in a talk show or even in the newspapers, because I understand the controversial nature of it, and Cypriots don't seem to me to be, on the whole, inclined to go to places in their past that are difficult, and this is a difficult part of their history. But there have been more difficult parts, as you can imagine, with the violence and mass killings that occurred and so forth, and partition. I did receive email threats from some individual who was not prepared to reveal who they were, but they haven't. That has stopped. So I'm not sure what happened there. This was actually before the book was released.
Really?
Yeah.
But it becomes problematic because this is what you're highlighting, is how certain individuals use the threat of coercion.
That's right.
To really try to influence the behavior of others.
Yeah.
And instead of having a more moderate and conciliatory approach, embrace a more, I don't want to say radical, but a more radical agenda.
Yeah, it is radical, yeah. Absolutely, that's right. And, these things happened throughout pretty much the modern history of Cyprus, particularly once Elgar comes to power, essentially, in the Republican period as well. And although it might have to a degree subsided after the events of 1974, these things were still happening on in that case in both communities as well. This doesn't just impact, although I don't really talk about the Turkish Cypriots in this book, but they adopt this type of radicalism later on in response to, and in some instances there is copying of Greek Cypriot methods, within their own communities.
Mm. But it's funny to see, because this is something that was about 90 years ago,
Yeah.
but it still moves people either to threat or to silence, not having, and,
That's right.
and it says a lot, because you would think, we would have had closure, we would have had an opportunity with distance to be able to have this discussion openly.
And as I said at the start, the records would have been closed until 2034. Just before I ended up, pursuing a publication with the Anthem Press, and after having had the article rejected twice, and in one instance, one of the reviewers was very positive, exceeding. I never had such a positive review, but the other one rejected it, saying that this is too controversial, and a line about saying, who cares if there was fascism in Cyprus in that period? And it's like, well, since nobody's written about it, somebody needs to write about it. But
that's a very academic thing to say, isn't it?
But in the end, I did have the entire file opened, the redacted passages removed, the 6 pages reinserted. So I was able to have a file that was closed for 100 years, opened well before that 100 years. But these controversies and controversial and files from the colonial period, not just in connection with Cyprus, but in connection with other colonial sites, continues to be an issue for historians, because so many files remain closed for long periods of time. And as I mentioned to you before, this file here, the other day, I put in a Freedom of Information request to have this file opened. Cyprus is the title, communism, relations between AGEL and EOKA, AGEL being, if you like, the Communist Party, which was established, so this is the date it was opened, January of 1958, and it ends December of 1959. And you can see here that it is closed for 120 years. That is the longest I have seen a file closed for. And the reasons given, exemption 1, health and safety. Well, whose health and safety would be at risk after 120 years? I mean, the file is not projected to be open until January of 2080 when I'll be 100.
Yeah. Well, it would be a good retirement project, certainly, but...
I don't think I'll be around. And the second exemption is personal information, presumably implicating or in connection with a third party. But I mean, after 120 years.
Picking up on this, and you're already requesting records, I'm wondering, what's the next project?
Mm-hmm.
What comes after this?
Well, there's other projects that I'm working on, but the one that I would say picks up from this is my fascination with two individuals in the UK who were the London commissioners of the Cyprus government. One is Sotiris Terazopoulos, who was the London commissioner from roughly around 1946 to 1956. And he suddenly dies in February of 1956. I mean, he's writing, he's working up until his death, and suddenly just dies at, he wasn't young or old. I can't remember his exact age off the top of my head. And his his replacement, Fedon Constantinides. He's a fascinating character. And I'll just finish on this last point. Just last week, I was consulting a file, and the file was dated from 1959, and it was about Fedon Constantinides. And what I didn't know is that part of the reason for his appointment was that he wasn't in the island when this was going to his house, but he was to receive a threatening letter from EOKA, a death threat, in fact, from EOKA, that his life was at risk if he continued to be anti-nationalist and anti-EOKA. So the British picked up on this and appointed him London Commissioner in 1956. So I'm fascinated by those individuals who wanted to drive a movement away from British rule through cooperation with British rule, but with the British, and not simply take a violent or non-violent antagonistic path, but to pursue a more constitutional,
reformist sort of Catholic.
And there seem to be quite a few of these individuals, and Terazopoulos is not exactly one of them, but he worked for the British, provided intelligence and so forth on the community in the UK. Fedon Constantinides was different because he was in Cyprus until 56, when he is then appointed to his position in London. But there are other individuals in Cyprus as well who continue to be part of this discussion within the correspondence on Constantinides, for example, like individuals that I talk about in this book as well. So, yeah.
Well, until that book comes out, I'm highly recommending Assassination in Colonial Cyprus in 1934 and the Origins of EOKA by Dr. Andrekos Varnava. What a read. Again, move over Poirot, the outstanding piece of scholarship.
Thank
I
you.
look forward to the next book, and thank you again for sitting in with us.
No worries, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right.
Yeah.
See you next time.